Hello, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be ranking the Shasvastii Expeditionary Force on a tier list. We're going to go over all the units, what their general purpose is in the sectorial, and how well they fulfill that. I like to think of Shasvastii as a kind of terror faction. One of their main strength relies on what information your opponent really has about your army. And for that reason, units often tend to play a very specific role inside the faction. You can think of Shasvastii as a kind of trapdoor army, one where your opponent has to move around invisible threats that may not even be there. And that illusion can be just enough power to really win you the game. And that's really the strength of the faction, and I kind of want to talk about that and go over some of the units that actually fit that role. So here we are in the army builder, and we're just going to go through them, starting with light infantry and then kind of go down. Now for the first unit, Mr. Dr. Worm right here is a pretty special guy. He's pretty universally good in almost every faction he's in. I mean, you have for 22 points, you get a doctor and an engineer who has a gizmo kit and a medic kit and can plant B charges. Willpower 14 specialist that moves 6-4. This is just a great unit, and I would definitely consider him in most of my list. And for that reason, I probably put this guy on the A tier. Now, the Seed Soldiers are pretty interesting, and I mainly like them because it's a midfield camouflage unit with mimetism, which is pretty interesting because Shasvastii as an army has a lot of these kind of profiles that kind of go in the midfield and hide, whether they be Mines, Calavans, or Shrouded, that we'll get into later. But more importantly, they are a very cheap specialist. At 17 points, you're getting a specialist that can forward deploy up to 8 inches, and that's pretty useful with anything. Now, they have pretty decent stats, and sometimes you won't take them just because there are better options, just a little more expensive, but if you're really looking for points, then this is a great option to kind of throw into your list and diversify it a bit. Now, the Seed Soldiers, for me, I think are a B tier. They're pretty useful, and you can definitely take them in a lot of missions. For example, if you're playing supplies, just having the paramedic up there at forward deployment can make it really easy to capture that kind of objective. And yeah, they're pretty good. I would definitely consider using them. Not all of the time, and that's why they're kind of in B tier, because sometimes you do want to take other units that kind of do their job a little bit more efficiently. Now, the Airborne Infiltration Group Cadmus. This is a pretty interesting unit. It has a very specific ability, and that is Morphoscan. Now, Morphoscan is an interesting ability because it allows you to basically steal the stats of another unit. And while it is a cool ability, sometimes it's really okay, and you're paying a bit of a price for it that it's just kind of a benefit. And regardless of that, it really is a cheap unit, so you couldn't go wrong taking it. It's a cheap airborne deployment unit with potentially decent stats and some good weapons. So yeah, I would not go about not taking them. I think they're great, and you should definitely use them if you can. And something I really like to do with the Cadmus is take the Red Fury option, because once we get to the Noctifer, I'll kind of talk about it, but this basically masks some of your firepower in your list, and being able to have that, even if it is not that, it basically makes your opponent play around something that might not even be there. And I think that's really one of the strengths of the faction, that it allows you to do that, and this is a unit that you can definitely take to kind of mask that kind of thing. I think the Cadmus is a comfortable C tier unit, and it's mainly because you don't really take him that often. Sometimes you do take him, and he's very useful in the missions where you do take him. But yeah, sometimes he just kind of doesn't really do a lot, and I found a lot of games where you kind of dropped him, and he maybe completes an objective, and maybe dies to a template. Sometimes he does go on a rampage, but that's just airborne deployment thing, and for an airborne deployment, it's alright. It's pretty cheap though, which I think gives it that benefit where you can kind of take it as a rogue pick. Now, the Hyduck is a unit that I think is a little underrated. Now, it's mainly because they have the MSB2 with a Sapper, and Sapper is an ability that, in my opinion, is very good. Now, the thing with Sapper is that you kind of have to stay your troop there and deploy that way, not really move it that much, and that's kind of the big detriment with the Hyducks. But if you're thinking about it, when it is in that Sapper state, you're getting a sniper rifle or marksman rifle for very cheap with multispectral Bicer level 2, Mimetism, and you're getting a 360 Bicer. And I think that's a lot of things that you're really benefiting from for such a low price. Not only that, but you can really link them, and when they're linked, they're pretty strong ARO piece. And I think the main problem with the Hydex is that there are better ARO pieces in the faction, and there's quite a few of them that we'll go over. And maybe that's the reason why it gets a little downplayed, but I think this is a unit that you could really take as a very niche option, and it's very usable, and I found that in some games it really does its job pretty damn well. Now, the Haiduk, in my opinion, is another C tier unit, and it's mainly because there are better options in the faction that you can take that really kind of benefit from that role, and they do that ARO piece a lot better than the Haiduk. But even then, just getting an MSB2 for that cheap, and in one of the only MSB2 options in the entire faction, the unit is definitely usable, and it has its place within the faction. Now, you won't see it as often, but when you do, it is still a threat that you kind of have to account for and not just kill in one shot. I really like it, so I'm going to leave it there in C tier. It's definitely not unusable, but there are better options that you could be taking. Now, the Noctifer is a very special unit. This is the unit that the faction kind of relies on, and it's really a unit that is scary. It's a scary unit. I mean, Mimetism 6 hidden deployment missile launcher unit. It's just terrifying, and especially in a faction where you can take several of them, and often people will take several of them. This really kind of hides a threat that your opponent always has to be playing around because they never know if it's there. And I think Shasvastii is best when you are playing the faction in a way where you are proxying some kind of Noctifer, whether that would be hiding a different kind of unit with a big weapon in camouflage or in airborne deployment. The faction is best used when your opponent is playing around this guy. And the presence of this guy is not even just on the field, but him existing kind of creates this dilemma where your opponent can risk it and play the objective forwardly, or he can play more defensively. And when he does choose to play more defensively, even if the Noctifer is not in the actual game that you're playing, it means that your opponent is wasting orders trying to play around something that may not even be there. And I think that's where a really big strength of Shasvastii in general kind of lies. The Noctifer is a great unit, in my opinion. This is one of the best units in the entire sectorial. It is really good because it forces your opponent to kind of play around. I mean, here for the options, you're really mostly taking the missile launcher. I don't think you're taking any of the other options here, but just the missile launcher with Dogged, Mimetism, and hidden deployment is such a strong unit, and it really forces your opponent to play your list really differently. Now, the Noctifer is obviously an S tier, and it's not just because of how it'll perform, but it is the pressure that this unit puts onto your opponent. Even if he's not there, your opponent is always looking out for this unit that exists, that is trying to destroy their core link team, it's trying to destroy their tag, their active shooting piece, their specialist, and it can do it. It can really go ham, and it's just an amazing unit. It's one of the units that really makes Shasvastii what it is, and why it makes it that kind of terror faction. And if you're not playing around the Noctifer, you're probably playing the faction wrong. And it's really a strength that you should take advantage of and really throw it in your face of your opponent to make sure that they fear you. And that's what you want. You want fear, even if you don't take them into your list. It is the illusion that he is there that really makes your opponent make decisions that will cost them orders and eventually will lead you to winning more games. I really recommend him. Even if you don't take him in every list, and sometimes I take him in like 40% of my lists, even then, his existence is just enough to put a fear into your opponent, and I think that alone really makes him an S tier. Ada Swanson is kind of a unit where she has a lot of uses, especially if you look at all the stuff that she has on her. The viral mines are really cool, especially with the mine layer. Means you can pretty much plop one out straight as you go. Now, the FTO option is, in my opinion, pretty cool because she's a wildcard in Shasvastii, which makes her able to go into a lot of different fire teams. Now, specifically, I'm looking at the Guilo. The Guilo fire team is something that she can go in, and she'll make it cheaper. And same thing goes for the Hydux if you want to experiment that way. And just those abilities alone, I mean, forward deployment +4, martial arts, and mimetism is also pretty decent. Now, you are paying, and I think the question you have to ask yourself with this unit is, what is her role? And usually, she's just a very decent mid-board cheerleader. And that's really what you're getting, and you're paying a lot of points for that. And I think that's kind of the reason why I'm hesitant to take it a lot of the times. Although, when you are building different fire teams, you definitely want to have her because she makes the fire teams cheaper and she's that useful cheerleader that you're going to want to bring along. The submachine gun +1 burst is also not bad, but it's very short range, which makes it sometimes not really that efficient. And I think the main detriment for Ada Swanson is that she's not a specialist, and that really brings her down. If she had the specialist keyword, I think she would be an amazing unit and probably a must take a lot of the times. But because she's not a specialist, she kind of really fills a role, and I'm not really quite sure what that role is. It's basically a 2-point cheaper unit that you can take in your fire teams to make them a little cheaper, maybe include a different unit like a Taiga. Now, for that reason, I think she's a C tier, and I mean she's great in melee as well. She's just very versatile, but there's units that kind of do this better in the faction, and you'll probably have these bases covered much better than what you could do with Ada Swanson. Now, the Calvin is what I would like to call another of the pillars of the entire sectorial. Now, this is one of the best units, not only in Shasvastii, but the entire combined army, and that's because of its range of skills, abilities, and weapons. Now, you have here a midfield specialist that can also be taken as a pretty decent gun, and the thing with the I want to talk about the Spitfire first, because the Spitfire is something that you won't see as often, but it's very viable, and it's mainly because this is kind of a unit that you'll have as a backup firing piece that you probably won't even get to use until maybe turn 2. And that means that your opponent is always playing around a second Noctifer. And that is a scary threat. That really makes it worth it, even if you're paying that extra amount of points. Not only that, but it's probably one of the best multispectral Visor units that you have in the faction. With mimetism and forward deployment, it's a great shooting piece, and it's a great piece because it plays the Shasvastii role that they want to play, and that's really tricking your opponent and making them think that there's things on the board that they're not. Now, you also have the Engineer, which is another amazing profile, and it's mainly because there's a lot of remotes in the faction that are really decent, and having this Engineer being able to repair them and kind of just go up and push buttons. I mean, it's a 28-point specialist with a submachine gun and a D-charges. And that's not even talking about the Pulsar, which in a pinch can come out and be a pretty good weapon. The Chain of Command is another option that you'll usually be taking, especially because of a unit we'll get to. But it allows you to have a unit as a backup in camouflage that will take over if your lieutenant ever gets killed. And that's pretty useful. Now, I find myself taking a Calvin in almost every single one of my lists. I mean, this is a unit that you kind of have to put in, and the ability 4 really makes it an optimal pick in Shasvastii to kind of take more of, and it's one of the reasons why you would even play the faction. It's just an amazing unit. It's great in melee, it's pretty decent at shooting, and it's a specialist. It's got multispectral visor. I wouldn't run without it. So Sheeskin is the kind of unit where you really want to take her a lot of the time, and it's mostly because you have one of the best shooting pieces in the entire faction at your disposal. I mean, it's a 54 point. It is very expensive, and I think that's one of the main detriments to Sheeskin is that she's so expensive. But you really do get that benefit. You are paying the points, and the points are oftentimes worth it because you're taking a ballistic skill 15 unit at base with a 6/4 movement and nano screen. Not only that, but she's a light infantry with 2 wounds and immunity to shock. Profion and martial arts just make the unit really versatile and kind of just excel at what you put her up to. And this is really the piece you want to use to kill other units. It is your killing piece, it's your main gun, and if you are taking her, she is going to be doing an amazing job at that. She's great for running up into your opponent's field and just destroying their order pool. Now, I would also like to add that she's a great option for fire teams, and a very cool fire team that I like to take is a Harris with the Noxus that we'll get to in a second. And it's mainly because you get the benefits of having that fire team with the stats that Sheeskin has. It really creates a monster of a unit, not only as an attack piece, but even as a piece to take down. And if you do use Profion, she basically goes up to 4 wounds, and Sheeskin on 4 wounds is almost unkillable, and it really puts that fear into your opponent. Now, she also comes with the D-Charges, which is a great benefit. Profion and D-Charges are a great mix, and they go together perfectly. Now, the Lieutenant is a very good option here, and it's probably one of the better Lieutenant options you have in the entire faction, because you can use that extra order on Sheeskin, and because you have access to Calvins with Chain of Commands, you don't have to be afraid if she dies. If she does die, then it's fine. You still have a backup, but often the time is that you want that extra order, because you want to cause as much damage as possible with Sheeskin, and taking her as the Lieutenant really kind of gives you that incentive. Now, Sheeskin, in my opinion, is an S tier, and I think this one is a little bit more debatable, but I really think she's an S tier because it's the gun you want to take. It's the main gun you want to take, and you want to be fighting with her, and there are other options you could take, but she really excels at fighting. Not only that, she does have the highest ballistic skill in the entire sectorial. And you couldn't go wrong with taking her as your main piece. And I think she's the first option for that shooting piece, and you consider her first before taking her out. And that kind of really makes her an auto-include unit and worthy of the S tier. Now, the Nox troops are pretty decent units. They're okay, and it's mainly because the link teams that they could go in are really alright at best. Now, Shasvastii is a weird sectorial where link teams sometimes are just not that great. Now, you can take link teams, and there's some cool link teams you can do that we'll get to later with the Noxus. But I mainly use them because you can link them with Sheeskin, and I think the profiles here that you often take are the Hacker for 14 points. It's a very cheap Hacker. And then you can also take a Paramedic to go alongside Sheeskin. And these are often what you are taking. The multi-sniper rifle with the guided attack, I mean, there are better options with guided, so you most likely will just not take it. And yeah, there's also the HMG at 21 points. It is a steep price you're paying, but it's one of the only units with an HMG in the sectorial. Luckily, there is a better HMG choice, so I would probably skip it. Now, the other cool thing about the Noxus is the Sapper. Now, Sapper can be a pretty decent tool. Sometimes it really pops off, and when it pops off and it goes off and you stop your opponent dead on his tracks, it's actually a pretty decent tool, and you're glad that you paid the extra points for. Now, the other times, it does nothing, and that's the problem. They're expensive with a lot of tools, and they do come with stealth, which is great. That means that in the fire team with Sheeskin, they won't break stealth when she's moving around. But yeah, they're just kind of a little expensive, and unlike something like the Fusilier, you're really not taking them for the Noxus themselves. You're kind of just taking them as a cheap support piece for other units. Now, the Nox troops are a B, and you might be saying why a B, and it's mostly because you're going to be taking them a lot, because they are your basic troops. They also have a lieutenant choice that you can have and try to hide them within a fire team if you wish to do that. But just taking them with Sheeskin, I think, is a good idea, and that's why I would probably put them in B tier. Now, the Mentor. The Mentor is a pretty cool unit. It's a really decent piece, and mainly because you will be taking it as your lieutenant almost all of the time. It is a camouflage lieutenant with a decoy, mimetism, and it comes with counterintelligence. And counterintelligence, sometimes it does matter. I mean, just having the extra order out in the first turn is just really decent. And it's just a good ability to have in general. And you're getting it with a lieutenant that you can really hide pretty decently. And I think where the mentor exceeds is some of the missions where your lieutenant counts points if they kill them. You really want to have a mentor to kind of mask that. And that is something like a firefight where the mentor really shines. It is also willpower 14, which is higher than most of the other lieutenants in the sectorial. And if you do end up taking the hacker, which is a little expensive because it has no kind of forward deployment, but if you do take it, it's a willpower 14 hacker, and it costs 28 points, which is not awful. And it comes with that template with the boarding shotgun. So it's usually all right. It's a great lieutenant piece, and that's mostly what you're going to be using it as. So the mentor in the list where you take him as your lieutenant is almost always going to be worth it. And I think just because of that you want to put him in the A tier. Now, you won't always take him because sometimes you will take Sheepskin, or you just don't have the points to take a mentor. And you want to take something like a Nox in a Link team as your lieutenant. But if not, the mentor is really hard to pass on. I mean, the extra order from counterintelligence is just great. And you have a willpower 14, which allows you to go first. And this faction does benefit from going first pretty good. So yeah, it's a pretty decent unit. I would put it in the A tier because it fills a role, and it fills that role really well. And it's a great second or even first option as a lieutenant. Now, the Dave Cutthroats is an interesting unit. It's one of the most peculiar units in the entire sectorial, because why? You have a unit here that has so many damn abilities. Now, Natural Born Warrior, Martial Arts Level Tree, Multispectral Visor, this is insane. And if you look at the weapons, they even come with more stuff. I mean, you can take a Taiga, which are great, and you can just take it with you as a sync unit. And then you also have these specialist units. I think the Red Fury is really interesting, and the Chain Rifle plus 1 burst with the EM grenades, which most of these profile has. It's just such a interesting unit, and you might see this and say to yourself, wow, that's amazing. But there's one fatal problem, and it's that it dies to anything. It basically dies to anything. Now, yes, the Mimetism -6 will protect it a lot of the times, but if you're facing any kind of indirect punishment, any kind of template weapon, this thing will just crawl over and die. It has 0 armor, so it just can't survive. It has 6 BTS, but it doesn't even have shock immunity, so Shock Mine will completely blow it out. And if you're taking this as your main gun piece or as a kind of support unit, you're paying a lot of points for it, and 2, if it dies, you just kind of lost that piece to something that should be easily avoidable. But there are times where the Dave Cutthroats really work, and those times it really feels like you're cheating the game. Just these set of skills and combinations are amazing when they work right. But there's a lot of times where the Dave just doesn't do it, and it just dies. And for the amount of points that it costs as a warband, it's way too expensive. It's way too expensive, and you're often not going to take it. Now, I don't think it's a D tier unit, and that's because it can be useful, and they are good skills. In a vacuum, they are amazing skills. I just wish the unit had a bit more survivability. So yeah, I think a C tier is a pretty decent spot. Victor Messer. Now, Victor Messer is really cool, especially because he has a hacking device plus, which means that you can throw out white noise and stop other MSB ARO units that your opponent may have out. It's also a decent piece for shooting. Now, the problem with, and most of the characters are kind of like this in the faction, is that they cost a hell of a lot of points. I mean, 30 points plus is just too many points for what you're getting. I mean, he is a wild card, which is great. That means you can pretty much put him in any team that you want. Him being a wild card is just great. But he doesn't count for any pure fire teams or anything like that, so he's just kind of there as a hacker. He is willpower 14, which makes him pretty useful. His defenses are alright, they're not that great. He does have nano screen. At the end of the day, I think he costs a lot of points for what he does. He does cost a lot of points. But if you want to have that white noise, and if you take him alongside somebody like Sheepskin, not only do you get a pretty decent specialist with willpower 14, but you do get that benefit going against MSB. So he's kind of a counter pick. And as a counter pick, I think he's okay. I would like to see him a little lower in points. He's definitely paying a premium for the abilities that he has. But he's all right most of the time. So I probably put him in the B tier. Now the Tensho, this is a secret pick of mine that I see almost nobody use, and it makes me a little sad because I think these guys are pretty decent. I mean, yes, it's 16 points, and it's a specialist operative with a boarding shotgun, and this is the profile you want to take most of the time. But this alone is pretty decent. I mean, you look at the Nox troops, and they do have the hacker, but the hacker costs SWC, and then the forward observer is 16 points. Now the Tensho is also 16 points, but it comes with shock, regeneration, and willpower 14. It's a better button pusher. It'll survive more often. It can bring itself back. It's a veteran. And I don't know why he isn't taken more. Honestly, I think he's a great unit, and he's a little underrated in my opinion. I would definitely take him a lot of the time. And I think the other thing you have to acknowledge is that he counts as a Nox, and he can be taken in the Nox fire team, so you can take him alongside somebody like Sheepskin to kind of go forward. And having the boarding shotgun as a template to stop opponents or kill sheep warbands is a great idea. Yeah, I would put the Tensho at a B tier as well, just because it does serve quite an interesting purpose. And if you take him, he hasn't really let me down that much. If anything, he's done the opposite, where he surprised me, where he's regened and survived. For that reason, I think I would take him and put him in B tier. Now, you won't take him all the time, and it's mostly because you want your hacker and paramedic. I think it's just a better combo. But the times where you don't want to spend that SWC on a hacker, or you don't want the hacker because you're playing against a hacking faction, then yeah, the Tensho Expert is pretty decent. Put him in a B tier. Now, Octavia, again, she's terrible. There's not a lot of factions where Octavia will be really that great. I mean, she doesn't even count as a Nox. And in a missile launcher, ballistic skill attack plus 1 burst, again, it's all right. You can do much better, especially in this faction. And we'll talk about a better missile launcher option that you can take. That it's a million times better than taking Octavia at 28 points. She's just not worth it. She's never worth it, and I mean, she's just terrible. I don't really know what to say. Definitely a D tier unit. Now another D tier unit. Now Agent Dukash is all right. I mean, this is a thing you'll see with most of the characters in this faction. Why do you have so many abilities? So many abilities that they put on these guys, and then they make them cost 39 points, and you have to ask yourselves, why are you taking Dukash? He is such an expensive specialist operative. Multi-rifle is not bad, but why take the multi-rifle when you have better options as a firing piece? And he's just not worth taking. There's better options, and you definitely want the points in this faction left. You want to grab as many points as you can, and just putting him in your list will make your list worse. And I think that's just the general sentiment to Dukash. I mean, it goes for a lot of the characters, but especially for this character who costs 39 points. It's just all right. It's a 1 wound model. 39 points, 1 wound model with a okay weapon. It's really not worth taking. Even if he is a wild card, he's definitely a D tier. Cool model, though. I do like the model. He looks cool. Sargach is another one of the units we were talking about. Same thing with him. Mimetism -6. Natural Born Warrior, number 2, Specialist Operative. A multi-rifle. Now, again, this is kind of the case where you just take the Dave Cutthroats. I think they basically do the same thing, and they're way cheaper. And even then, they're not that great of a unit. And if you're taking Sargach, you're really shooting yourself in the foot and kind of making your list a little worse. Because you are a jack of all trades, master of none. And I think this exemplifies this unit perfectly. Now, yes, it is a beast in melee and whatnot, but it's only 1 wound. It's a 37.1 wound model, and it's just not worth it. They kind of like the Dave Cutthroats, but even worse because it so many points. Sorry. So that's it for the light infantry. Let's go to the medium infantry now. So Korax is a Spitfire unit, and why you would take him, and it's kind of important here, because he's a ballistic skill 13 that can go in the Nox fire team and count as a Nox for composition bonuses. Now, do you want to take that? Most of the time, no. It's really not worth it. A Spitfire in a 5-man fire team is just way too slow, especially when you can be doing much better things in the faction. Now he does come with no wound in cap and immunity to shock, which is nice. It does make him pretty useful. He's also a specialist, so he can push buttons, and he has nano screen. The problem is that he's too slow, and you really have to link him to kind of get any benefit from him than you wouldn't get from a different troop. And yeah, for that reason, I think he's takeable. And if you're building a Nox fire team, you might consider him. And that's the only point where I would really take him. But even then, he's a little too expensive. But he's not awful. He's not the worst thing you could get. And he wouldn't really ruin your list, but it would be a different type of list that Shasvastii is a lot worse at doing than the kind of stealthy midfield army that they really want to be. Now, let's go to the heavy infantry, and we'll start out with the Guilo. Now, the Guilo is a unit that some people hate, and some people like. Now, me personally, I like him, mainly because I think he looks cool, and also he's one of the only units in the faction with MSB2, and one of the only units where you really want to take him at MSB2. You can grab a really cool link team with the Guilo and some other units. Usually what you'll take is Guilo, Sheeskin, an M-Drone, or Ada Swanson in a Harris. And now you have a heavy rocket launcher with tree burst in the active turn, an MSB level 2, and you have pretty decent close range shooting, close range melee, and just it's basically a death bowl of a unit to move up. And before we go even further with the Guilo, I want to specify that what makes the Guilo decent is albedo. Albedo is the only reason why you would even consider bringing this guy. I mean, there are other reasons, but albedo really sells him. Albedo is a really decent skill, and it's kind of what you're paying for these amount of points to kind of bring him. You are paying for that albedo, but when the albedo works, it's very good. And on a unit with a heavy rocket launcher, and by the way, the heavy rocket launcher is what you want to take most of the time. You could consider the other options. I think they're a waste of time. The heavy rocket launcher is what you want to be looking at, because you're paying less for MSB2, and I just think that's amazing. Now to note, BTS 9 is great. That means that if they're going up to the midfield, it'll be pretty hard to hack them. Makes the unit pretty durable against that kind of thing. Armor is right. I mean, it's a Shasvastii unit, not great armor. Another cool thing you could do is you could actually take him as your lieutenant and not use the lieutenant order. Because if you're taking Sheeskin and you're taking Noxus, you can actually hide your lieutenant in a way where your opponent won't know if it's Sheeskin, if it's the Noxus, or if it's the Guilo. Now, is that a intelligent choice? Not really, but it is a choice, and it's interesting to kind of just play around with. And the immunity to shock really makes it, because you can't bring this guy back up, and he's a pretty decent arrow piece. So yeah, the Guilo for me is a B tier. I won't take him that often, but sometimes I do take him. I think he's well worth his points, and the very specific role that he plays is a very good role, and he plays that role excellently. And I really think that's kind of what makes up the value for the Guilo. Now, yes, some people do hate him, and they probably would put them in the Guilo in D tier. Personally, I like him a lot, and I think he's all right. He's a decent unit. The boarding action Sheeskin, it's really all right. I mean, you are paying 10 extra points to make Sheeskin hackable. You don't want her to be hackable, and I think this unit often doesn't see any play at all, and that's a smart choice, because you really don't want to be paying that extra points for the extra armor that you get for it. Now, I will say there's a very specific scenario where I do like the boarding action, and that's when you're playing Frostbite, where heavy infantry does matter, and having a heavy infantry being able to do those objectives and being able to live at the end of the game is very useful. But even then, you are paying the extra points for it, and often the times it's just not worth it. There's a better version of this unit. It's just, why would you take this version where there's a better version that you can use? Now, yes, armor 7 is pretty good. It's pretty decent. And that's kind of a weakness that the normal Sheeskin has, that she's only armor 1. But at 63 points, it's just too expensive. And unless you're really gearing your list to a very specific mission, I just wouldn't really bother with her. You just have a better option with the light Sheeskin. She's definitely a C tier unit, maybe even a D tier, honestly, but I'll leave her in C tier because she's still good. If you take her, she will be a good unit. Unlike the units in D tier, they're just not great. But this is kind of the case where she's a good unit, but there's a strictly better option in the faction. Now let's go to the remotes. Now Shas is really cool because they have pretty decent remotes. I kind of like most of the remotes that they have. Now starting with the M drone, you got your classic forward observer drone. I mean, he's pretty decent. Kind of just how it goes. 16 points. You get a forward observer that has 6/4, has a repeater. It can just go in the middle, sensor camouflages, and just do your objective at willpower 13. Not a bad unit at all. Now the thing with the M drone though is that there are other options in the sectorial that we'll get to that kind of do this midfield specialist thing. I mean, and we already talked about the Calvin, but there's another unit that just kind of does it better, and you'll often be taking that instead of this. But if you do want the extra repeater and you're wanting to take that kind of thing, you wouldn't go wrong taking an M drone. They're cheap enough that they're pretty decently useful. I think I would put them here in the B tier or C. They're kind of between these two. Now the Q drone, I love the Q drone. This is your unit. This is the guy. This is the guy. And why is this the guy? It's a total reaction bot, mimetism -3, 360 bicer, and you can take a heavy machine gun or a plasma rifle for basically the same price as any other total reaction bot. You're taking one that has mimetism, and the mimetism is huge. It's surprisingly very big, and it does make a difference. Now strap this bad boy up with marksmanship, and you have a pretty strong shooting piece. I think importantly, what you really have to think about is that in Shasvastii is really bad at this kind of range band with the heavy machine gun. You don't have a lot of units to kind of cover this range band really that well, and the Q drone is the unit that you will take to cover this range band. So not only is it a great ARO piece, but it's kind of a best-in-class piece for that kind of mid-range attack. So yeah, the Q drone is very much worth taking in almost every single one of your lists if you have the extra points. Not only that, it's decently cheap for a good weapon and unit. And if you do want the extra points, you'll probably end up taking it. I end up taking it a lot of my lists because it's just that powerful. The mimetism really brings this unit up. And yeah, some people don't like total reaction bots, and I think that's okay, but I think this is one that you really should consider. Now the T drone is really cool because the T drone is an Ox. It is an Ox. So you can pay 17 points to have this in a fire team and count it as an Ox and have a pure missile launcher bot with ballistic skill 15. Now, how good is that? It's all right. It's all right. It's a pretty decent firing piece. It's kind of like a Fusilier. The thing is, it does have remote presence, and because you'll probably be taking some kind of engineer, it means you can reliably bring this back, and it's not going to die very easily. So surprisingly, it's a good ARO piece, and usually these guided missile bots you don't want to use in ARO, but this is a unit that I would actually consider running if you really want to go for that 5-man fire team of Noxus. It's a very expensive fire team, but you can take some interesting options to kind of fill it in. And obviously guided is pretty decent. Problem with this faction is that there's no pitchers, which kind of makes it a little rough to kind of play that hacking game, but just having those defensive midfield hackers can just surprise spotlight somebody, and now they're taking a missile to the face, and it just kind of plays a double role as an ARO piece, and sometimes even a shooting piece, because you have that long range option to go. The only question you will say is it better than an Octofer? Probably not, but it's still an interesting unit, and you could probably take in a list and kind of build around. It makes the T-drone a B tier unit where it's not awful to take. There's definitely better options, but it would be interesting, and it's an interesting kind of thing to just kind of take a core and build it around the T-drone with the other Noxus. It's not bad. Now the R drone, availability 1 in Shas. And actually going back to the Q drones real quick, they are availability 2, which makes them pretty decent. But let's get to the R drones. The R drones have 1 availability, and they do have mimetism. They're 7 points, they're cheap, they move extremely fast at 6/6, and they're a repeater. I don't think there's a lot else to say. What I do want to talk about is I think there's better options in Shas than the R drone, and it's mainly because you can take the Taigas and the Icadrons that we'll get to in a second. They just kind of fit the point defense piece a little better than the R drone. So sometimes, and often it happens that I just don't have space for the R drone because I want to take the other units. But if you're really building on the heavy cost units, then the R drone is pretty decent. You couldn't go wrong with it. Now, slave drones are great. Engineers are pretty good in this faction. As you can see, there's a lot of good pieces that are drones, remotes, structure pieces, and that makes the slave drones pretty useful. And I think they're really useful specifically because you can link them to a Caliban who's in camouflage. And yes, your opponent will know that it's a Caliban because you linked the slave drone to it, but the fact that you can do that means that you're taking a midfield skirmisher specialist that can repair two things at once. It's great. It's worth the points most of the time. So yeah, slave drone, EC A tier. I'll put it next to Dr. Worm. Now the Icadrons, as you might know, are some of the best remotes in the entire game, honestly, if I'm being honest. I mean, if you look at this, you're paying 9 points for a regular order with a template weapon at close range, a flash pulse at long range. It's a repeater, it's a baggage bot, and it's just great. It's BTS 6, which does come, sometimes it does come in handy, having that extra BTS to ward off some kind of hacking attack. But it just means that these units are not only great because they give you cheap orders, but they're just great at defending. And you're paying 2 extra points for a piece that can defend really well. And if you compare it to other baggage bots in the other factions, it's just night and day. I mean, those don't even have a weapon that they can shoot out usually. Now, that really makes the Icadrons a S tier unit, and my argument is that you're never not taking a Icadron. I think you're always at least taking one of these. And I've played against some people who the Icadrons have just flamethrowed them and killed their 30-point model, and I think that's just worth it. And it's definitely worth it over the R drone because it still has the flash pulse. Now, the E drones are an interesting pick, and it's mainly you're picking them if you want to really support your Q drone and have it as an extra firing piece. And oftentimes that is worth taking. You have a hacker that moves 6'4" as well for that many points. It kind of moves forwards and does objectives. So sometimes you'll take the E drone, and you'll probably take it often over the M drone, right? And if you're taking the T drone in a link team with the missile launcher, then it makes the E drone even better. And you can also take it with the Catmus. It's just kind of a tool that has a lot of purposes in the sectorial. Just having that kind of option with it, I think that makes it pretty great. Probably put it into... Yeah, I think it's a B tier. And it's a B tier because sometimes you do want to take it, but it's not as oftentimes that you'll take the Q drone and the E drone together. But sometimes you do want to take it, you want to support it. If you want to play some kind of game around the Catmus and the Q drone or the T drone, it is worth taking. And yeah, that really does put it in a B tier. Not only that, but it is a specialist that moves decently fast. Oh, there's the R drone. Let's also put it. Yeah, so for the R drone, I'm probably putting it in C tier. And it's kind of what I explained. I just think there's other options that kind of cost around the same points. But even then, you couldn't go wrong just taking this guy to fill in your list. Now, let's go to the tags. Here we have the Sphinx. And the Sphinx is one of the most interesting units in the game, in my opinion, because it is a tag with hidden deployment, with camouflage, and with climbing plus. This is such a versatile piece to take. You can basically climb, you can take down any kind of ARO pieces or soft defenses that your opponent takes out pretty easily because of the mimetism and the camouflage. And then at the end of the turn, it just goes back into camouflage and you keep it safe. The Sphinx is a pretty fantastic piece most of the time. Not only that, but the main problem I have with the Sphinx is that it doesn't have any kind of armor piercing, which basically makes it a lot harder to kind of fire and take down other tags and other heavy ARO pieces that your opponent might put up. But often is the time that won't be a problem because Shas is an army which can take other units to kind of deal with those things. And it makes the Sphinx kind of rise and be even better. Now, I think there's a good argument to be made of where's the best position for a Sphinx. And I don't think it's Shas. I think Onyx it might be a better point to take it in, or just in vanilla combined army where you can support it with more orders. But even then, if you do take it in Shas, it's not an awful unit at all, and you wouldn't be wrong with taking it. Now, at 93 points, it is quite expensive. It is quite expensive, but it is worth it if you're using it as your main shooting piece. It's ultra fast. It has pretty decent armor, pretty decent guns. It can basically go one-on-one with most opponents, most ARO pieces and sheep defending pieces, and absolutely destroy them. And that's really why you want to take the Sphinx, to kind of bully those smaller pieces. But yeah, the Sphinx for me is definitely a B tier unit. I wouldn't. You have to take it and you have to build around it because of how expensive the Sphinx is. Now, the argument that I was saying is that I don't know if Shas really is the best place to take a Sphinx, but you can definitely take it. Shas has strong ARO pieces that can kind of go with it and just kind of protect it. In any case, it has those long range options like the Noctifer and those close range options like the Caliban that can take down stronger ARO pieces that may bring a problem to the Sphinx. Other thing to note about it is when you're taking those battles at Mimetism 6 with the surprise attacks, there's really not a lot of things that are going to be fighting this thing favorably. And that's really what makes the Sphinx such an amazing unit. And it probably worthy of a B tier, even if you're not going to take it most of the time. The times you do take it, it's quite a menace. And again, it hides an Noctifer pretty well. At 2 SWC, your opponent, if you are going second, your opponent will be guessing if you have a Sphinx or you have a Noctifer, and often they'll think you have a Noctifer, and they'll try to play around that. So, once again, another great reason to take it. First here we have the Shrouded. The Shrouded is a piece that you really want to take in most of the time in Shasvastii. I mean, there's really not a lot of arguments to be made why you're not taking the Shrouded. I mean, it's a really cheap unit that you can take as a specialist that has infiltration and camouflage and goes up to the midfield. That alone is, I think, a good enough deal to be taking it. Not only that, but you do have regeneration if he does go down. It doesn't mean he's down, and if your opponent makes that mistake, it'll come back up, it'll score you the point, and kill a unit. The Mine Layer profile, I think it's great. At 23 points for a Mine Layer in the midfield, I think this is a great profile. Forward Observer, again, 23 points for a specialist in the midfield with camouflage. It's really, really decent. Now, the Hacker profile is something you can also take, as well as the Killing Hacking device. The thing is that Shasvastii really kind of struggles in that hacking game, I'd like to say. Even though they have decent willpower, the fact is, I think there's other hacking factions that really will overpower them. So sometimes you don't want to take the hackers, but they are there, and they're super useful. At 25 points, when you're playing a mission that requires a hacker, this is something that you will want to have. If you're taking a T-Drone as well, the Shrouded is just a great unit to have. And this is one of those units where you will see them in almost every single list that Shasvastii takes because they are that cheap specialist that you want up the board, pushing buttons. So yeah, the Shrouded is definitely an A tier unit. I mean, you're going to take it in most of the list. And it just really does its job pretty well. I don't see why you would not take it. Now, the Malignos is very interesting because it plays two roles. One, it plays the Shrouded. Now, the Shrouded role it plays, it's a little worse because it costs that extra points. You do get the Mimetism, which makes it a pretty decent midfield fighter. But even then, it's very expensive for what you're kind of getting with the Malignos. Now, the other thing it has is hidden deployment. And that hidden deployment means that you can basically take it as a proxy Noctifer, a thing that the faction loves to do, and it's one of the things that you do want to kind of play around. And the main problem with the Malignos is if you're taking something like that, and let's say you're taking the multi-sniper rifle, you're paying more for this than what a Noctifer cost. So why would you take why would you take the Malignos over the Noctifer? Probably not most of the time. And I think the case here is that the only profile here that I think is decently worth is the Killer Hacking device. It's a specialist, it's a decent fighter, hidden deployment with a Dacer, and it includes mines. It's 31 points. It's alright. It's very expensive for what it does, but it's not awful. I do think the other profiles are just too much. You're paying too much for what you're getting, especially with something like a combi rifle. Like, it's just not worth it. But surprise attack specialist in the midfield, it's a pretty decent unit. I do think this is kind of a C tier unit, and you won't be taking him that often. But sometimes you do want to spice it up. It's a great proxy for an Octofer and just... Now, the Speculo Killer. Here we have one of the other great pillars of Shasvastii. Impersonation is just one of the strongest, or the strongest ability in the entire game. I mean, that's up for debate, but looking at it, you have an Impersonator. It's a little expensive with 1 SWC or 1.5 and 30-something points, but that's fine. I think even at 40 points, an Impersonator is worth taking, because you have a unit that deploys right next to your opponent's starting zone, and that ability is extremely strong. And just being able to kind of put them inside your opponent's deployment field is even stronger. And the Speculo Killer, not only does it have badass model, I love how they look, but it really does bring that terror. And that terror is what Shasvastii is great at, is about making your opponent fear. And if there's nothing to fear most, is that of a Speculo Killer in your deployment zone next to your ARO team. This thing can cause a lot of damage. It's the only unit in shots with smoke grenades too, which is very interesting. Sometimes it is useful if you throw down the smoke grenade and you have something like a Guilo in your list with MSB2. Maybe you'll start trying to shoot a tag or trying to shoot some kind of wing team that you've now covered in that smoke. But if anything, it's just a great defensive tool, and it's a tool for the Speculo Killer to move through the opponent's field, and I think that's pretty useful. Not only that, it has the all-power monofilament CC weapon. I love this thing. It's a one-shot behemoth. It will slice through tags like butter, and that is amazing. And it makes this such a scary piece, where if your opponent does not deploy in a way where they're not predicting a Speculo Killer, you will punish them, and often more than that, if you have the first turn, they will win you the game. Now, again, the thing with playing against Shasvastii is that you have to look at the Speculo Killer and think, what if they have a Speculo Killer? Which means it forces your opponent to deploy in a certain way that may cause them to lose over orders, be less efficient, and just kind of paranoid. And that paranoia is a big role, kind of like the Noctifers. It's just it's a big role that plays into your opponent's fearing and wasting orders over things that may just not be that dangerous. But that trapdoor that Shasvastii plays, the Speculo Killer, plays amazingly, and it's one of the best units at it. Now, interesting profile in Shasvastii is the Mine Layer, because Shasvastii is the only sectorial that has access to this profile. Now, it used to be a lot better, where you can place mines along your opponent's fire team, and it would just blow them up altogether. It was an extremely strong profile. Now that it's nerfed, it's kind of a thing where if you want to take it or not. I often end up taking the boarding shotgun instead. But sometimes you do want to get a little tricky. Maybe you take 2 of them. A great reason to play Shasvastii is because you can take 2 Speculo Killers, and maybe you kind of just want to mix it up. Maybe put one in their deployment with the mines. And they also have regeneration, so if they die, they're not dead. Your opponent has to spend another order to double tap them. Speculo Killers are undoubtedly an S tier. They are an S tier, true and true, and one of the best units in Shasvastii, and probably one of the reasons why you would play Shasvastii. They just kind of bring that terror, and a unit that brings that fear into your opponent and makes your opponent play around it is definitely a unit that's deserving of the S tier. Now we're getting to one of our last units here, and that is the Taiga. Now, Taigas historically have been amazing units, and they still are. They got nerfed, they move less, they cost more. It doesn't matter. They're still great, they're still amazing. You're going to use them to fill your list most of the time, and sometimes you'll just take a second group full of Taigas. And you know what? It's not a bad idea, because Taigas are just that strong of a piece. They're your midfield warbands, and they are so cheap. The Taigas trade up incredibly well. 6 cents and Berserk 6-4 movement really makes this a unit that your opponent has to kind of take down, because if it does get into your midfield and it starts taking out higher point units, it's really going to be a problem. And even if you do take it out with a Shiki Mine or a Shiki Shot, it doesn't matter. They lost 6 points, you lost 30, 40, 70 points just to a Taiga, and it's happened a lot of times where a Taiga just kind of goes and ends the game in turn 1. and that's something you don't want to do. And the fact that a 6 point or 7 point piece can do this just makes it absolutely insane. At 4 points they were crazy, and at 6 points I think they're still crazy. Now you'll never take a spam of them. It's interesting. Availability 8 is definitely tempting to just kind of run a meme list with a lot of them, and you could, and it would probably work just fine. The other thing I want to note about the Tigers is that they're great at dodging mines and templates at physical 13+3. It really makes them just amazing at doing that. And even if your opponent, even if you run them through the midfield against an ARO piece, they're still dodging on a 16, which is not awful. And half of the time they will make that dodge, and they'll continue moving forward and being annoying. And even if they die, it was 6 points, so it's not even that big of a deal. Your army's still there. They're regular order, so it didn't matter that much. Tigers, they're an S tier. They're an S tier in every faction they're in. They're one of the best units in the entire game, and you just couldn't go wrong not taking them. This is the tier list I have here. There's probably a lot of changes to be made. Now, this is how I envision this tutorial. You guys can have your own opinions. Please let me know in the comments. And if you have any other suggestions that you like this kind of content, make sure to comment about it, subscribe, and I'll definitely be making more videos of this types. And I have a different kind of video coming up. And yeah, overall, thanks for watching. And yeah, I'll see you next time.